Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Menu Combat. I'm your host, TheWolvesDen, and if you are a person who loves to customize their party in any RPG we're playing, this is the podcast for you. And there are three parts of the podcast. There's what I've been grinding on, what I've been reflecting on, and what is the Bard's Tale of the Week. And what have I been grinding on this week? Tales of Vesperia. Now, one quick short thing. I actually have beaten Mass Effect. So if you were interested in the last episode where I was talking about my foray into Western RPGs and kind of exploring Mass Effect, I beat Mass Effect 1. I want to come back to that later and give that some different thoughts with some distance. But if you are curious as I go on that journey, we will get back to it. But for today, Tales of Vesperia. Now, I think it's about a year, maybe even as far as a year and a half ago, I started my playthrough of Tales of Vesperia. I ended at the end of Act 1, and I didn't go back for a while. So for those who don't remember, at the end of Act 1, Yuri Lowell does what I think has ended up making him one of my favorite JRPG protagonists ever. He kills one of the main villains while everybody's asleep, just because he knows that he feels like he needs to. And he feels like, in particular, that justice won't do what needs to be done. And I think for me, when I think of JRPG protagonists, it's often remorseful, hesitating to kill, graciousness. And I know that Tales is actually in an interesting place. I haven't played Berseria, but people have talked about Berseria being a game about revenge. But I think Yuri stands out as a character willing to do what needs to be done, but more so just this agent of his own justice. And it's just quite fascinating. It's an action that I just haven't seen up until this point, especially painted as the protagonist. And I think maybe one of the things you're starting to see that I appreciate in games like in these JRPGs are characters who are a little bit of moral quandaries, right? Where you're like, what is driving them? What is the thing that they're doing that, as opposed to just wanting to be good or gracious or forgiving or on the right side of history, what are you willing to do when you're unsure if things are going to go in the right way? Or do you have more of a nuanced view of what's going on? In many ways, right now, the game paints him as this side gray protagonist, right? Like, he's the main protagonist of the game, but especially at the end of Act 1, Yuri Lowell stands as, I'm here to support Carol in the building of the Guild of Brave Vesperia. And so Carol, in a traditional JRPG, might be your main character, right? Has gotten doubts from previous guild members. People don't really appreciate him. And you are being on a support on his growth to maybe be more of a traditional character. I know some people don't like Carol. I really have grown to appreciate Carol's role in the entire party. But Yuri Lowell is special. And I'm excited to see what decisions he ends up making, right? Because that's the thing at the end of Act 1. He makes that decision. Nobody knows that he makes that. And inevitable conflict is about to bubble up. And what choices we'll make and what happens when people find out what he's done. So the real interesting thing with Vesperia, though, that I had complicated feelings about is the game's combat. So I don't know how to explain Tales combat to you, at least this era. So Tales of Vesperia is you run into an enemy, you get into a traditional battle, but it's an action-based battle. And they have 3 tiers of combat in terms of that you can do middle plane combat, low plane combat, and high plane combat. And what do I mean by that is that if you're just tapping A, you're hitting in the mid direction. If you're tapping up an A, you're getting the top tier hits and then the bottom tier hits, and that matters in enemy placement. So if I'm fighting a flying enemy, I have to press up an A, whatever. But your character is very much attached to the ground. And the problem that I found in the early versions of the combat is that things kind of felt repetitive over and over again. I think I've told you all when I've gone back to even play a little bit of Star Ocean 1. Star Ocean 1 and Tales are connected in the sense of that back in the mid-90s, I think Tales comes first. A portion of the team moves on to create Star Ocean. And so there is a lot of connections in how the combats have been. So I remember one of my negative thoughts for Tales of Vesperia for a while, was like when I had started dabbling in Star Ocean, is that Star Ocean is mid-90s. Why does Tales of Vesperia not feel different? And I was wrong. I'm glad I did not have that take too early, because that's one of the things that's really been sitting here as I engage in action combat, where now I have to look at things very differently. And I just have to be honest, Tales of Vesperia's combat is pretty remarkable with the amount of details and subtle nuances. And I think one of the things I even want to say is that I don't have certain skills around canceling. So folks who have more of a fighting game background can truly appreciate what's going on. So I mentioned you're kind of glued to the floor. You can press up and it could get you to jump. So sometimes that can be misread as inputs when you're trying to press up on your normal action and you're jumping and you're not doing the actions you want. And that's been annoying. So I don't like flying enemies because you're so glued to the floor. Your normal hits don't normally make it, and then you kind of finicky go back between jumping and doing the actions that you want. And so at first I was like, oh gosh, man, coming back to this is rough. But one of the things that really makes this game really special, and I started to see it on my return, are fatal strikes. So what is a fatal strike? Any enemy you attack, if you do the up combination, so that means up and normal actions and up and special arts, you deplete their those actions. And so what happens is that if you keep doing that over and over again, you almost get like a break in them, and that if you tap R2 after you quote unquote break that version of their shield, you can instantly kill them with a fatal strike. And so what it means is that if you know your arts well, or you like configure your arts and combos well, you can get rid of enemies faster than normal. That's because that's a little bit separate from your normal HP. And then when it comes to bosses, what it means is that if you pull those together, it's not an instant kill like it is with a regular enemy. It becomes one of those things where you get super damage. And so it becomes one of those things where, are you comboing consistently? Are you comboing into arts in the same like register, right? Are you doing all ups or all sides or all belows? And certain enemies are best for that. Some flying enemies, obviously, you want to do all ups to be able to get through that. Or if you want to do something that's super heavy, you might want to hit it on the floor, hit their like legs to avoid their shields. Like, it becomes something more thoughtful. And what I like is that in regular battles, it just becomes a way to speed through battles. But in boss battles, it becomes, okay, can I chain this? And then your other characters' attacks can affect what you're doing. And so what you want to do sometimes is that certain arts have elements on top of that. So you might want to bring in a character who can do an up attack to sync with what you're planning to do. And do they have the element that the major boss is weak to, and becomes one of those like party constructions. I don't really want to go further in to how this played out in this boss battle. And so where I am is in the west, I think it's called Westland Coves or something like that. And I'll tell you how that worked out. But I just want to really highlight that Tales of Vesperia combat is banging. Like, this is truly remarkable. I'm excited because the thing is that it's still like a 2.5-ish D plane kind of thing. As I said, you're attached to the ground. You can press L to like free roam, but you're always like on a guiding plane back and forth. And so sometimes this game can feel stiff. But what I got into was this moment of zen. And one of the additional things that I've noticed is that, so as I mentioned, you can do arts. And so you configure your arts left or right stick and the art button, up on the art button, down on the art button. And then you start gaining more arts. So that means you can do art moves with the other stick. But I could never like randomly get my head around switching from the left stick to the right stick for combat, because that also kind of goes in between of how you are directly moving on the plane. But what I noticed is that I can do the right stick and the trigger button, and it became a whole thing of like, now I'm chaining regular moves, art sticks with the left stick, art sticks with the right stick and the trigger, and I'm now in this full zen mode of combat. And it makes me look at how my options are vastly different. And I think what I appreciate is that it's the boss battle that I was in the middle of that really challenged me. And so what the boss battle I'm dealing with is this bat that is one giant like ghost bat at first, and then it turns into like a leader bat, like 10 different attacking bats, like 4 different magic bats, and it was just a fundamental challenge. Forgive me for the wonderful police trying to save somebody, maybe, plausibly. No comment. Now that that's set, the way that this works is that you're trying to attack the normal bat and you're doing all of that, and then you have to switch over to the regular, the like assortment of bats. And I tell you, I was getting myself whooped. And what I appreciate is that this got me to really look at what was happening, engage with the elements and systems well, and be more intentional what I was doing. I think part of my arguments that I was having before about Tales of Vesperia combat is that I was engaging with it mostly passively. And that's not always wrong, right? Sometimes you just want to be on an adventure and just experience it. But because it had felt so a little bit odd or sometimes very stiff, right? You can get staggered very easily. Going back and forth is kind of a little funky. And so I've had critiques for this combat system a lot, but this weird battle where you keep attacking the ghost bat, then it dissolves into a bunch of these bats, and what ends up happening is that you get swarmed so easily. One of the things I will critique this game is that it has terrible crowd control. But what I realize is that if I have terrible crowd control, which is that you can normally just do moves to 1 or 2 enemies at best at a time, that means I need to change my team. And so what I'd been running up until this point was just no longer working. I had been running Yuri, Judith, which are 2 melee attackers, Estelle as my healer because she's the only healer in the game, and then I was probably running Repeat at first, and that was just not working. I mean, I switched it. I was like, okay, let me get a long distance attacker to deal with these multiple bats to help support what I was doing. So I flipped in Ravens and Archer. That didn't work. I even tried playing as Raven or playing with different characters to see maybe the fact that I'm using Yuri is probably a disadvantage if I play with somebody else. That didn't work. And what I really just had to come to the conclusion is like, I need a mage. A mage is built for crowd control with the spells that they can cast, and there's only really one answer, and that's Rita. And so I flipped in Rita, and that started making a difference. I still couldn't beat it. The additional piece that I really had to think about was what was giving me troubles going back and forth from the giant bat into the swarm of bats. In addition to being swarmed and needing crowd control, I was not paying attention to the attacks that were doing the most damage. So I was getting frustrated because not only am I having to attack so many different things, the mage bats would cast this magic that was kind of frustrating. And what it was like they put a magic water jug ahead of you, and it's just like spilling water all over you. And it's not just that it interrupts your movement, right? Because at first I'm like, oh, I'm not running away from it enough, but I'm moving, I'm using free roam, I'm using everything, and it still will hit you. So the hit is inevitably coming, and it's just very damaging. Sometimes I would knock out about half of my health as Yuri, and that was just not going to work. And so what I had to do is that it's a water damaging spell, so I need to equip myself with something to resist a water damage. I think one of the things that's been very weird about this game, and it's not bad, it's just it plays around with how I'm thinking. I'm used to enemies with elemental attacks being extremely explicit about being those kind of enemies. So if I was facing a strictly fire enemy or strictly whatever enemy, I'd make decisions around that. But bats in water is just not a thing I conjured in my head. And so I was like, oh, I don't need no elemental resistance, but it's like really paying attention to moves being used against me, how much it's damaging me. And so I equipped, I think it was a blue cape or like an aquamarine. And that alone made a huge difference. So I think about all these changes I had to make and then be very intentional about attacking certain enemies, trying to use the combos I was mentioning earlier to get fatal strikes quicker to consistently do this again. And then when it switched back over to the big enemy, doing the same thing where doing the up combos to get the fatal strikes, to do extra damage. And I felt like this battle got me to coalesce all these different parts of the Tales combat into one. One of the things I just can't imagine, though, if I'm being honest, is how in the world did they not really give you the options before the definitive edition to switch your main character on, but you have to buy, like S pose items, which I think is supposed to be a Pac-Man item, the S flag. Who thought that was a good idea? You'd think Because one of the oh man, I haven't even talked about this part of the Tales of Vesperia combat is that similar to like something like FF9, you learn skills off of weapons. So part of what you're doing is that you're equipping different weapons, synthesizing different weapons. I mean, we can even talk about a synthesizing system. There's really is a lot here, but different weapons to pull off skills. And so if you keep that weapon on, you always have that skill, but you might switch it to a weapon that has morphing, and so you only have like a limited amount of technical points to, not technical points, what do they call them? Skill points to equip certain skills. And it's different. And the main thing you're focusing on is who you're using. But why are you trying to teach other characters these skills if you mainly can only control one character? Again, I'm saying this for the definitive edition, you can choose anybody. So it makes sense to like give people different skills. And you could equip them, right? Like you still do that. But a lot of skills, and this is one of the things that's made me really grow to appreciate Vesperia, is about affecting movement. And so on my Yuri, I have equipped you can block, but if you tap back and Y, you do like a hop, skip back, and then you can do elements of that to prevent being staggered if you get hit while doing that. You can also do other things where you can affect the amount of moves in your basic combo if you equip things called combo plus, or you can do taunts to build your over limit. I haven't even talked about over limit. Oh gosh, when I tell you this game has so much. So one thing I hadn't said to this point is that arts take away from your TP points. So you have a minimum limit in arts, and sometimes you can do normal attacks, you can build it back up. But if you do over limit, you first you stun your enemy a little bit, then you have like 2 different time bars of just being able to unload arts with no deplenishing TP. It's incredible. And so therefore I'm being conservative about doing link up combos to arts before, but then it'd be just like, I'm gonna just unleash all my best actions at this point. Oh gosh, from a combat perspective, the more and more I talk about this, it is truly a remarkable, deep system. I just wish it felt a little bit better, and that's why I kind of like how they have the skill system, because you can add things. You can add a roll on top of certain things, or you can even improve the agility of certain people by like 5% to change how they move. And so you can see what they're doing in terms of equipping you with elements, equipping you so you can play the way you want to play, or in the case of me, just like what feels good. There's a lot of customization here, and I think that was one of the things I was doing before. I was being a little bit too passive with the combat system, and I felt like the regular enemies weren't challenging me. And at first, you just don't have a lot of options if you're keeping it honest, where at the very beginning of the game, you don't feel like you have a lot of options. What are you really doing? It's not until now where I have almost most of the party, I can really start making different decisions. I think if you want to get into things that I would want more from this system, and I'm curious for the folks who are big Tales fans. If you're a big Tales fan, tell me if the other games are like this, because really, technically this is my second Tales game, but really for the most part my first. I think I've told the story about Symphonia before. One of the things I'm most curious about when I think about this is there is just one healer, right? I get it. Carol gets I think it's a down action to do a little bit of health, but outside of that one thing with Carol, it doesn't feel like anybody thus far is a viable enough replacement for Estelle, or does healing in different ways than Estelle in a variety of useful ways that make you feel like, oh yeah, this is worth the trade-off. I feel like Estelle has to be a part of my team. And same thing with someone like Rita. Rita has pretty much not the only, but the main offensive magic. And so if you just want a mage to fulfill that, again, if I wanted to solve that conversation about crowd control, I don't have a lot of options in terms of characters. And I do, mind you, some of that might just be the way that I conceive building out my party, using party. I want a healer, I want a magician, typically. And just because I don't have multiple of those, I don't ever really feel that there is a vast set of choices, because they give you a lot of characters. They give you Raven, who's an archer. They give you Judith, a spear user, who's very aerial based. You have Rapide, who's fast on the ground. You have Patty, who's like supposed to be somewhat of a powerhouse with her her swords. You have Carol, who's super slow but with his swords. And I think based on how the game is framed, I think we'll get back. Who is the other guy in the Knights? Dang, I can't forget. Blonde guy. He looks like Kaikisuke. That's all I can give you. I forgot his name. All that to say, if you're gonna give me so many options, I would like more options even further. Also, this is not really important, but it's been one thing that's annoying me. Why can't Rapide be the leader of the troop? Why can't I play just as Rapide? And maybe I'm missing something, but thus far, I tried one of the things when I was trying to figure out how to beat this, boss battle, the bat boss battle, was that I wanted to play as Rapide, right? I mentioned I tried playing as Raven. I won't play as Judith again because she's a little bit too floaty for my liking. But I was like, oh, Rapide has a lot of strength, has a lot of speed, has a lot of combos and elements that might be useful. But I couldn't choose Rapide. So for those who don't know, I realize I should make it clear. Rapide is a wolf who is essentially Yuri's dog. And he's great. He interacts with the party great. Estelle and Rapide don't necessarily have the best, most amicable thing. She's in fact jealous that Patty and Rapide have a good relationship. Rapide is just wonderful. This has been a fun experience, and I think I'm glad I was a lot more patient with it coming back to it. It is a long game, and I do think there's some other critiques I have of this experience. I'm gonna just say the one that I think stands, and I can see what conceptually they're doing, but it's annoying. They have their version of private actions, which sounds great. So for those who remember private actions in Star Ocean, you go into the towns and then people kind of break apart if you trigger it, and then you go talk to the people, you get a little bit more intimate engagement. And so this game does that without having to trigger anything. You just kind of go into town, everyone will be like, oh, I want to go do this, I want to go do this, and you talk with everybody and then you regroup at the inn. It's nice. It gets some really good engagement and some thoughtful conversations, and you get one-on-ones with Yuri in ways that I think are just important for building the relationship of different characters with you. And one of the things I'll even highlight is that Raven says when you go to, I think it's Mantake, the desert town after you do the cave, it's like, Yuri, people are kind of relying on you. And he makes that emphasis of Raven's the adult in the group, but really everyone's depending on Yuri. And I think you talk about Yuri talking to other people is really a good way to highlight the deepening relationship with other people, but the sense of responsibility he's bringing up, especially in light of his character being a defect of the Knights. It provides just a nice texture to him growing. But outside of those things, one of the things that gets frustrating is that people keep coming in and out of your party. And in towns, it makes sense. As I said, it's for you to explore, go find them in town, talk to them, engage. So, but outside of that, sometimes people come in and out of your party just randomly. And it's not just that they'll come back and you talk to them and come back to you. Every time I've gone to a town, at least since I've been playing again, and so that means I'm Nordopolica. That even means before Nordopolica, where I went on a ghost ship. That means the caves. That means the town. So that's 3-4 different locations since Act 2 has started. People be like, well, this is what I need to do. This is what my goal is. This is my goal is. So are you sure you're coming? Are you sure you're coming? Where at the end of the day, the answer is that this group loves each other. Like, we know this. You don't need to sell that to me. We know that these characters have deep affection and love for one another. But it keeps trying to re-justify, and I get it to a certain extent, specifically Estelle being the queen, or not queen yet, really, having to have a quest done by Brave Vesperia affects her decision making. But when Rita's like, oh, I don't know if I'm coming, or it gets frustrating over and over, because it'll be in like a span of 3 hours saying the same kind of thing, where it's like, just accept that y'all want to be around each other. When you split up, you can just say, hey, let's take a break. I don't think you need to re-justify plot wise while we're doing this. And maybe it leads to one of the other things that's challenging about playing Tales of Vesperia. Not challenging like it's negative, but it is a critique. This is really a bunch of, and it's funny because I normally say this is a good thing, but it just doesn't hit the same way. This is a bunch of a slice of life-ish, not slice of life, but like episodic moments. And typically I love that. I love Dragon Quest. That's a very vignette driven thing. But I feel Vesperia is just not as elegant about it. I'm explicitly thinking right now, you leave town and you have to do a whole bunch of things to explain leaving town, and you bump into a ghost ship and you just go on it and you're like, what is going on here? And it's fine. Like, I don't mind the ghost ship. In fact, it has a really incredible gimmick, one of the best gimmicks I've seen, which is background mirrors with ghosts and trying to use that to maneuver or see the enemies around you or find hidden items. It's a great dungeon. But fam, what does that do for the story? Or how does that even fit? And I think that this game is struggling to consistently highlight how things are fitting. And it just feels that when these people talk about, like, this is what I have to do, this is what I have to do, they keep explaining to you, trying to justify the story beats that are happening. And maybe one of the other things to be honest about, I've taken a break from a game for a long time. In theory, this should be helpful, but it's just not. As I said, it just feels, everything does feel very individual, and they're trying to like give you the bread crumbs of how things are coming together, but it's just not elegant. It's just not. And maybe I'll feel different later, right? Because I see what they're trying to do. So the very stories that you do the ghost ship, you find this box. This box interferes with somebody's magic. You assume that it's going to affect the air credit thing, which is this whole environmental world building, the Blastias. And so you're saying that this is affecting people's magic. You know that guilds are lying to you. And so there are a bunch of details that seem to be somewhat woven together. And so what they're trying to highlight is that everything's wrapped together. Or give people justification of why they want to go to new places now. Or other people. And it's just not elegant. And maybe I'm tripping. So this has been my experience with Tales of Vesperia. From a combat perspective, I am over the moon, and I love Yuri and I love Estelle. Yuri is in my short list of all-time greatest JRPG characters, and I genuinely love the character archetype of Estelle. The rest of the cast is solid, but I'm not blown away, nor am I deeply enamored. I am curious to see how they do Carol, because I do think Carol sits in a very fresh spot. But for those who, as I said earlier, have a good history with Tales, what combat feels more fluid? What combat gives you multiple options for mages, multiple options for healers in unique ways, so that when you're building your party or choosing out of like a cast of 8, you feel like you have multiple options, and adding that to some of the best things that this game does, which is the art system, the fatal strike system. It's a deep game, and I'm curious for those who have more history with this series, what do they do better in other games? Because I've heard before that Vesperia is the best of the Tales series. I know that Arise came out. Some people feel like that. I know Symphonia, we'll talk about later, another day, isn't that? So that's been what I've been playing. And you can see I was really passionate about this. Now, let's spit about to what I've been thinking about. So part of the story I talked about with the the boss battle with the bat is needing to change my party and so forth. One of the things I also did is accepting that I had to go back to town. One of the most aggravating moments, and I'm not the only person who's been here. You're stuck at a boss. The dungeon's depleted your resources, and you're really coming to terms with, I'm gonna have to go back to town to get some potions, some healing items, some poison, all the stuff you need. And the first thing that's in my brain is, do I really have to take this trip back? And that's just one of the most disheartening moments in any RPG, because it not just means I have to do the dungeon backwards. I now have to deal with whatever random encounters, or in this game, there's not random encounters. Then I have to do the trail back to town just to re-equip, and then I'm going to have to go back and do everything again. That is one of the most frustrating parts. It's one of those where, I'll say this, Bravely Default giving you a shopkeeper right at boss battles is one of the most beautiful things. Praise the Lord. But I just want to say that I think that's just a plight that we all face as RPG fans. But one of the things that, if you're like me, you notice is that the trip there and the trip back are very different experiences. And I've been thinking about two things. The act of exploring, how that affects the way you see paths, and the act of revisiting or returning on a path. And so that's what happened. One of the things when I was leaving that dungeon, I noticed, it's not that long. It's not that crazy of a trip. And part of the thing that we don't talk about in dungeon design is the act of picking what path to pick. Making decisions of like, why would I pick this path? What's along this path? The act of figuring out where to go is such a different cognitive process versus that I know where to go, I know the path back, I know that. And so that alone cuts the experience quickly. And then obviously you can talk about in Tales that you can skip enemies or avoid them. Then on top of that, you in a lot of games, even going back to Dragon Quest, you can ward off enemies with whatever it is that allows you to minimize. But I've been thinking about, so I talked about going back in that dungeon and starting over, but I'm also thinking that trip from dungeon back to the town, it's because you don't know where you're going that makes you look at this experience through some more of like, I gotta be cautious. And I think so much about how RPGs in scenarios like this, and these are not the only scenarios where, I know this path, you don't longer feel as cautious. You no longer that. And I think so much about exploration, about the decision of what path to pick / unknowing what's ahead of you and how that affects your play or how you feel about how time is passing is such an interesting thing. And revisiting places can feel like triumphant, right? It's one of those things where going back to town here didn't feel bad. Right, I realized it was quick, but also I was like, I'm powerful enough. I can go through most of these enemies already. Like, only the boss is the challenge, and so going on paths can make you feel so much more powerful. And games do this all the time. I'm thinking FF5 does that, where you're revisiting different locations, or when the worlds like merge and you revisit a place, you're like, oh yeah, this is an easy trip. It gives you a great sense of progression and growth. I also think about how you kind of sometimes are looking forward to seeing what's next, right? And I'm thinking Chrono Trigger, where you revisit a place and you're like, what is it going to be like here? I'm thinking explicitly about when you leave Robo with the girl, I think, in the church, and then you go like forward in time to the same location to see how it's different, and you just see Robo outside like mowing the lawn. There's something to be said about how revisiting certain locations or retracing your steps can be great. And then there are other times where you're like, this is hell. Because I mentioned the sense of feeling strong in Tales of Vesperia. I mentioned how in Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy V, you kind of see how things are different. But let's talk about Earthbound. Retracing steps in Earthbound is a pain. For a long time. It's not until you get the second traversal technique that is it relatively easy. But two things happened that really drove me crazy. Is that anytime you want to leave Earthbound dungeon, the way that enemies are placed, it's a grind. And the dungeons in Earthbound can sometimes be very, very frustrating to navigate and make sense of. And so typically you want that to be a one-time trip. And so sometimes I'm thinking about those trips that you have to make back. You're like, this is the last thing I want to do. I'm going to have to face these enemies twice. And the funny thing is, I like random encounters, but I think this is an example where, yeah, that's just more frustrating by default. We just gotta call it what it is. And I think Earthbound just has a high encounter rate, so that doesn't help it. And then it's funny, right? I'm treating Earthbound as if it has random encounters. Yes, you can see the enemies above ground, but there's no real way to avoid a lot of them unless you're going back into a dungeon way later. I'm talking about retracing the steps in the dungeon that you're currently at. And so, and really annoying dungeons traversal wise. It's, as you can tell, sometimes it's frustrating, and Earthbound is not the only one. where you just dread the coming back and forth. And I also think a lot about how much this is being informed by my experience with Bravely Default. I've talked about how that is very foundational for how I see and engage with games. I mentioned buying items by the boss, like that alone. You don't get equipment, but you can get items. But beyond that, I'm talking about the segmenting of my mind between I'm in exploration, I'm here for the grind, I'm ready to do this thing, I'm ready to go in different paths, get lost and figure that, like, there's a way of engaging, or if I'm ready to grind, just grind alone. There's a disposition when I'm in a dungeon ready to do that versus I'm just trying to get to this place, man, I'm tired. And I think Bravely Default, because you can turn encounters on and off, increase the amount, decrease the amount, that separation between those things are so high for me that it's just frustrating in games that don't allow you to kind of segment them off. And I think that's why I appreciate in Tales of Vesperia, where I can recognize, oh, there's not a lot of too much crazy paths, and by the time I reach the boss, the enemies don't feel threatening, so I don't feel frustrated. But other games don't always do that. But I'm curious for you, how do you go back and forth between this exploration phase and this I know this place phase? The other thing I eventually want to talk about, but I'm not there just yet, is talking about traversing on maps or traversing in general. Like, I want to scope this out to a larger piece about exploration. But that's for a different day. That's what I've been reflecting on. Just the mental act of exploration in a game and how that affects your experience in a space versus I know this space and how that affects what's going on. And then how when one is forced onto the other, it can be a little bit of anger inducing. Now, let's talk about The Bard's Tale. So, there are 3 songs that I found this week that I'm just excited to think about and engage about and reflect about. Dark Cloud, The Spirit King by Tomohito Nishiura. Them chimes, man. Them chimes. They're either chimes or very light bells. And so there's like a core bell melody, and then at the end of every melody, they pull up the pitch, they go up a note, and it's just... It's a little bit plucky. It's just wonderful. And there's this like low tone of strings that just like create the like layer, a thick atmosphere. And then you just have the piano on top. I've never played Dark Cloud. This might be one of the things that gets me to do so. I've seen reviews. I don't know if I'm going to like it, mainly because I do not like level 5 take on town building in Ni no Kuni 2, so it's a very hard sell for me to go to a game that they did that's strictly town building. But I'm not lying to you. That song from the soundtrack was really tranquil, atmospheric. Like I felt the thick fog of mystery. It's a beautiful song. Next one is this Atelier Marie remake that came out this year. And it's done by Daisuke Achiwa and Toshiharu Yamanishi. And this is a beautiful song. There's a little, like, I don't know how to call it. At 12 seconds, there's like this little stutter that I feel like I'd easily sample for like a rap song in this like soulful song. There is a little bit of like a flute that comes in at 34 seconds. The hi-hats are just doing so much work. But it's that guitar. Oh my gosh. The guitar is just beautiful. And it feels like the main percussion here. Because there's a light rim shot. And you almost don't recognize it given how like layered into the mix it is. And it isn't until they drop the guitar to just do like some of the flute sounds do you feel like the percussion is entirely right. But it's really just that the guitar is so heavy that it's almost acting like... It's not a kick. There's no kick sound, but it feels so driving the way that a kick would be. Oh, man. This... And then at the very end, there's like a light piano spiel. Oh, this is a good song. It's called think it's called Ender of the Blue Dragon or Blue Fox, Blue Wolf. It's these guys were on some other level of stuff. And then last one, I've never played this game, Amori, A Home for Flowers by Pedro Silva. You know, some games talk about being influenced, and I know that people say quirky Earthbound like RPG, and I know that Amori falls into that space, and I don't know to what extent or what it's doing, but musically, it just feels like they took whatever sound font from like some of the, I would say the Earthbound final boss battle or some of those like major moments and like reconfigured that for the core piano here. I mean, they have a light synth that's very quaint, and then it's almost like a toy like atmosphere. It's because it's just so light indie poppy with how the piano is being played. It's truly remarkable. It's an incredible song. Pedro Silva put his damn foot in that tune. It does make me want to check out the rest of the soundtrack and see what else they do, because that in general, even removing the Earthbound, like that toyetic, playful, I would expect some like xylophones here, something of that nature, is just really, it gets you into this wondrous place, right? Because I keep wondering why am I associating this with childhood? It's like this childhood wonder of like looking at the stars, and it's cheery, it's soothing, it's all these things. It's a beautiful song, and yeah, these guys were on some other stuff. So thank you for listening to this week's episode of Menu Combat. And this actually concludes the core first season. The idea here is that every break, so I'm in academia, so that's kind of my life right now. So I won't be releasing regular episodes. The intention from here on in is that you'll get probably like episode at least every 2 months, and then we are going to try to work our way back in for season 2 next summer for sure. Up until then, expect it like Kingdom Hearts, a bunch of side episodes at different intervals, but the consistent run that you got here, that wasn't perfectly consistent, so I appreciate your patience, is not going to be done until next summer season 2, but we will have multiple episodes, and we might get a little bit more during Christmas break. I can't speak to that one for sure, but I have a couple of episodes cooking up in terms of some games to talk about with some guests that I'm excited to have, so you won't be left waiting for too long. But we are not going to be every Monday like I was trying to aim for during this season. But I appreciate you listening to season 1. If there's anything you're excited for season 2, as I think about how ways to improve this going forward, when I have more time, or the next batch of time that I'll have, please let me know. I do intend, as I mentioned, sporadic episodes, and I do want you to let me know what games you want me to play so I can actually have time to talk about them next year. There's a certain game that I think people want to hear my opinions about, so there's one. It's one beneath the mask. I'm gonna leave it like that. On that note, I am TheWolvesDen 25. You can find me at TheWolvesDen 25 on Twitter, on Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. You can find Menu Combat on Instagram, Threads, Twitter. Also, find me on TikTok at TheWolvesDen 25. We are so grateful that you guys listened. If you have a review that you want to share, I didn't even get to mention that, but if you have a review you want to share, please give us 5 stars on Spotify, 5-star review, or whatever you actually feel like. If you think this has been a terrible experience, you can let me know so I can find ways to make this better. But leave it on the Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, or even just create a video. We genuinely would love that. And I think that is everything at this note. We appreciate your time. We're excited. As I said, we got another episode coming up pretty soon, given what the game is pretty short. But this concludes season 1 of Menu Combat. On that note, peace, love, unity, and don't forget to customize your party.